Welcome to another episode of the Paradigm 132 podcast, and I am your humble and gracious host, Rashad Horn. As you can see, I am not in my home office. I'm in my truck. I had to work a little bit extra this week. I wasn't able to make it home, but one of the good things about that is that I usually get a day, sometimes 2 days, mainly to myself, where I get a lot of reading done. I get a lot of my research done for a lot of the podcasts and things that I do whenever those particular situations present themselves, right? So, what I initially wanted to talk about on this particular show was have social programs helped African Americans in the way that African Americans intended for them, right? So, preface that. So Saturday, I needed to do some laundry and get something to eat. So I said, well, I'm going to turn on one of my favorite podcasts, catch up on, some things that are going on. So probably about maybe 5, 6, 7 minutes into it, I said, I'm really not feeling listening to this right now. So I went to YouTube. I simply typed in economics. So probably the third or fourth video down my search engine. So, well, not my search engine, but you know how they are. The third or fourth video listed was titled basically the myth in economic inequality. And it was an interview it was an interview that was interviewing. Let me get this right. Bear with me. The person that was being interviewed was named Thomas Sowell, and I never heard of Thomas Sowell before, right? Never heard of him before. But after listening to his 52-minute interview along with 4 to 5 other videos that I saw of his, I immediately went to Amazon and I purchased 3 of his books. I didn't purchase the 3 of his books because I wholeheartedly agreed with everything that he said. My reasoning for purchasing them is that I understand that in order for you to convey a particular message to people is that you need to understand both sides of the equation or both sides of the puzzle or a difference of opinions, right? Now, as I've said in the past, I listened to Dr. Claude Anderson. I've listened and read every one of Dr. Amos Wilson's work, Dr. Umar Johnson, Chancellor Williams, Ivan Van Serta, these particular people like this, right? But as I've progressed on and from a cognitive standpoint, I said, okay, well, we have a section within our community of people that don't 100% subscribe to those particular ideologies, right? And Candace Owens is one of the first people that I would identify as a person like that. And I recently purchased her latest book that I'm going to jump into right after I get finished with the book that I'm reading now. So, Thomas Sowell, I believe, is aged 88, 89 at this particular point in time, still sharp as a whip from an intellectual standpoint. I noticed that right off the rip. So the interview that I watched, he touched a little bit on his upbringing. He dropped out of high school at 16, living in Harlem, New York, and this was during the 30s and the 40s, right? So this is roughly 20 years before the Civil Rights era. He went to go work for Western Union, making roughly 50 cents an hour, which that's going to be a key point that I'm going to go back to, but I want to go ahead and get all of this stuff out right now. So he said there was a couple of ways from his job that he could get back home. There were, I think, 2 subways, and there was 2 trains. One particular train, well, No, 2 subways, 2 trains. 2 subways and 2 buses. I'm talking too fast. 2 subways and 2 different buses. There was one particular bus in general that he talked about that you paid a little bit more to ride. But with that came the advantages of going through the well-off neighborhoods. Now, up until this particular point, he has stated that throughout his 20s, he was a Marxist, right? Believing in the readings and the teachings of Karl Marx, because he said when he would get on that bus and he would ride through the well-off areas, and then he would get to the areas that were poverty-riddled, he would say that, well, there's only one way that this could be possible, and it has to be that the rich have seemingly stolen money or extracted all of the money and resources away from the less fortunate people, right? So that was his ideology. That's what he believed. So he said after working at Western Union, he went on to be a part of the Marines for roughly a year. Left the Marines, went to go applied, got into Harvard, went to Harvard, and got his graduate degree from the University of Chicago. So he talked about it was one particular summer that he went to go work in D.C. With the Department of Labor. And his job was to study the effects of minimum wage, because he said at that particular point in time, the overwhelming theory around minimum wage was that as minimum wage rose, the amount of jobs available started to diminish. So one of the main things that we hear today is that people need to have employable skills. People need to have employable skills. People need to do this and have this particular stuff like this to get these particular high-paid jobs. Obviously, that's one of the main things that is being stated now as the U.S. is trying to become more eco-friendly, is that they're going to be having eco-friendly jobs that are going to be paying higher wages, and individuals need to have the skill sets to actually acquire these particular jobs, right? So we hear that, even to this day. But he talked about during that period of time, he was tasked with studying Puerto Rico and their minimum wage situation. So what was going on was that there was 2 theories going on in Puerto Rico as it pertains to the minimum wage, as it pertained even more to why there were less workers, right? So the 2 theories were, the first theory, which is the overall theory, that the minimum wage seemingly priced out individuals that did not have the skill set to acquire these new jobs, right? When I hear that, I think about a story that I heard, and I can't remember the publication that I heard it on, but there was a person that went up to a job site in China, and he talked to the general foreman, who was Chinese, obviously, who were in China, and he asked him, because they were digging out a trench, and it was, I can't remember the exact number of men that were out there, but they all had shovels. And so the guy told him, he said, you could get this job finished a lot quicker if you had some tractors. And so he said, the Chinese man looked at him and said, well, if I do that, what am I going to do with the individuals that don't know how to work the tractor? Where are they going to go work at, right? So that is the overall general theory consensus, is that individuals are seemingly going to get passed up because they don't have the skill sets to quickly adapt to things that are going on. The second theory that he stated was that there were a series of hurricanes that came and seemingly destroyed the sugarcane industry. So because there were less crop, they needed less workers. And so he said the theory that he came up with, or what he realized, was that the government has their own set of initiatives when it comes to minimum wage. They have their own initiatives. In part that they are not trying to better the lifestyle of everybody. And that's not what they're trying to do by raising minimum wage. Because I've talked about this seemingly in the past, that okay, you can raise minimum wage to what, $15. Okay, there'll be more part-time work. There would be a lot more automation. That's why they're not just all of a sudden doing it overnight. It's a process. They'll say, okay, we'll raise minimum wage up to $15 an hour over a 3 to 5 year period. So that 3 to 5 year period means that they need to get whatever they need to get in place, and people will be left behind. And so people will be left behind, and so then you have more people that, as he refers to, be a part of what he deems or has so eloquently labeled the welfare state, right? So, now going back to what I said about him making 50 cents at Western Union. So he said when the first, or some of the first set of minimum wage laws came down, the minimum wage was 40 cents. Minimum wage was 40, but he was working in a time where there was no minimum wage, and well, I take it back. I said it was minimum wage, but he was making 50 cents an hour, but it wasn't considered minimum wage. It was only considered minimum wage when it came out and said, okay, minimum wage is 40 cents. So basically, before minimum wage, he was making more money than what they deemed or dubbed to be an amount of money that would suffice people in the workforce, right? So he went on to talk about basically how social programs have been detrimental. Now, he wasn't just solely speaking about African Americans. He has a more macro or a global thought pattern. His thought pattern is that problems that are seemingly in America are not solely American issues. These same particular issues and thoughts can be found in other countries around the globe, right? So he wasn't just solely speaking about it from a black perspective. So one of the things that he talked about, and was a thought that I had as well, and sometimes when I see people readily go towards this particular thing, they go there and then they go back over here, right? And I think to myself, I say, wait a minute, wait. There is a saying that two things can be true, but at the same time, some things are so in your face. The evidence is just so in your face. The evidence is so empirical to the point that it makes no sense for you to even jump on that side of the fence. And I'm gonna break it down because I may be losing some of you right now. The interviewer read him off a quote and stated that black people seemingly are in a situation that, due to slavery, is still a hindrance to this day, right? It's still a hindrance to this day, the effects of slavery. So he stated that, okay, the data states that from 1940 to 1960, African Americans in this country, the poverty rate dropped down from 87% to 47%. And then from 1960 to, I believe, maybe 1970, 1980, it went down another 18%. But he said that had to do with provisions and things that had already been established. But also at the same time, it was at a slower rate. So yeah, that's what it was. It was 1940 to 1960, then from 1960 to 1980. So from 1960 to 1980, it only dropped down 18%. But from 1940 to 1960, it dropped down 47% and he attributed some of the 18% to some of the things that were already in place from the 40s. So he stated that obviously from a dollar figure standpoint, African Americans are doing a lot better, but he says when you have incorporated and been a part of the welfare state, you look at some of the disturbing things that have occurred since the welfare state has been established, where he talked about how, obviously, and we've probably all heard this before, that in the 50s, 60s, and stuff like that, the amount of black children that were raised in two-parent households were in excess of 80, some was up to 90%. Whereas when we talk about today's term, the amount of children that are raised by single mothers is in excess of 70%. So he stated his thinking, or his process is saying that we're in the 1940s, right? Still in what we would deem to be the Jim Crow era, right? The Jim Crow era. But from a poverty standpoint, if we look at some of the things that transpired, Tulsa was before the 60s. Durham, North Carolina was before the 60s. Rosedale was before the 60s. So there was a lot of places before the 60s. I'm sure that we've seen the graphics that talked about the land ownership amongst African Americans before the 60s was so massive. But after the 60s and what ended up becoming, as they stated, the war on poverty, he stated that everything took a turn for the worse. And he talked about how certain things affect different groups in different ways. He said now you have a situation nowadays where you can get incentivized or subsidized to not get married. It's a better situation. They'll put a roof over your head. You get money to eat. Now, you may not be living large, but you have that. Whereas if you have a male in the house, you get none of those particular perks. You get none of that. So, going back to what I stated before, is you have people that talk about Tulsa. And we're just using Tulsa because Tulsa is one of those places where a lot of people, it has garnered a lot of attention because of a lot of people are just now becoming knowledgeable about the heinous activities that transpired to completely wipe out that particular set of people. But if you look at all the greatness that transpired, those people did not get reparations. Those people had what we would call a culture, a sense of togetherness, so much so that they were able to create something that even in 2021, we don't have a shining example of that today. And according again to Thomas Sowell, it has a lot to do with the liberal welfare state that has been seemingly unleashed on the black community as well as other communities, but it has been more so detrimental to the black community than that of any other particular community. Now, he's not in favor of reparations by any of the videos that I saw. And basically his reasoning is that the data and the statistics show that we've been excellent people without reparations. But he believes that institutes, which we could swap out for government, and laws in which he, and also in none of the videos I watched did I hear him say white supremacy in any stretch, right? So obviously you have, certain intellectuals that they don't necessarily address that particular thing. And it didn't seem like in any of the videos that I watched of him that he felt that that was a hindrance in any shape, form, or fashion. So again, that was one of the things that I but I did disagree with, because his philosophy is a lot simpler. He stated that since 1994, married African American couples have a poverty rate an unemployment rate of roughly about 7%, whereas single black people have a unemployment rate in excess of 22%. Now, obviously, if you study the unemployment rate and stuff like that, it's a kind of tricky system. You won't get the actual raw, real numbers, simply due to the fact that unemployment rates are only calculated by individuals that are A, receiving unemployment benefits, or B, still actively seeking employment. It doesn't cover C, which are individuals who have seemingly or completely dropped out of the workforce. Because if it included all of those individuals, the numbers would be staggering, right? So that's kind of how that is. So now, getting back to his philosophy basically, and this is something I can agree with, right? Even though he's fallen out of favor, and he's probably been out of favor with a lot of African Americans within his country, I still feel like he's the most accomplished African American in this particular time period, or in the 21st century, until someone supersedes him, and that is Dr. Ben Carson. Now, I read one of his books and I was truly inspired by the book. And the biggest takeaway that I took away from that book, which I spoke about in a podcast previously, was the fact that he grew up in Detroit. And it was rough during that period of time. And he talked about how his mother made the concerted decision that he and his brother were going to go to the library, check out a book, read the book, and then on Friday write her a book report. And he talked about how early on he didn't like it, but as time went on he began to love it. And he attributes that decision made by his mother as a catalyst that helped propel him to the heights that he is now, right? And so, getting back to Mr. Sowell, he says that lifestyle has staggering ramifications. Certain lifestyles have ramifications. And he talked about how while there seems to be more money within the community, as far as the black community, crime is running away. And crime is running away mainly due to the welfare state, which again is an institute, which again we can substitute out for government, which we could also institute out for white supremacy, if that's where you want to go with it, right? But again, I'm going to focus on his words, or his word, institute. So we have a liberal welfare state, which is an institute, which could be government, which could be white supremacy, all of that. But again, we're going to focus on his word, institute. So the interviewer asked him, he says, so basically what you're saying is that if there was no welfare state, that violence wouldn't be what it is? And he said, basically, the data suggests that yes, it wouldn't be. Because you had a more wholesome group of people that had more, I don't know how you want to say it, had more stewardship, basically, had more rules, were a lot more, I don't want to say faith-based, but they were just a different type of lifestyle, right? They were more decent people, so to speak. I'm at a loss for the words right now, but those were the type of people they are. And so it kind of coincides with my last book that I wrote, which is titled Porter City 2: The Rebirth. And I recently done an interview, and the interviewer asked me, he said, okay, well, what was your motivation for writing this book? Or basically, what is the message that you're trying to convey in this particular book? And I basically told him, and if I could sum it up, this is what I sum it up as. And I've said this on other interviews that I've been on as well, and speaking about this particular book, is that all plants come from soil, which come from the ground. So you can put that in the place of an environment, a neighborhood, right? You have some plants, some vegetation or whatever can grow with limited amount of maybe sunshine, limited amount of water. Whereas you have other plants, other vegetation that needs a lot more attention, right? And so the plant that may not need as much attention as the other plants, it sprouts, it grows, it gets plucked, it goes off. It never comes back. And that's the advent of the individuals making it, leaving, and giving you this generic cliche of, well, if I made it, you can too. Right? If I made it, you can too. Right? They give you that, right? Without understanding that sometimes that plant over there needs a little bit more water. Y'all came from the same soil, right? You may have been destined to be this. They may be destined to be that. But if they never get the attention that they need to get to where they're supposed to be, then they may feel like that the mission that you were set out to do, that was their mission. That's not the case. That's not the case. So, getting back to Ben Carson, as well as Thomas Sowell and even Candace Owens, we have a demographic of African Americans within our whole community that don't necessarily look at slavery as being a hindrance. And we've had seemingly uproar where people say that we should seemingly forget about slavery. And Thomas Sowell, more or less, is of that ideology where you should kind of forget about it, right? Now, I don't agree with that. But what I will say, right? What I will say, because I like to play devil's advocate a lot. I stated in the past that I don't think about slavery per se. I think more so about Jim Crow, the Jim Crow era, because the Jim Crow era, a lot of the things, a lot of the legislation, a lot of the thinking is still prevalent to this day. And what ends up happening is, I think about that more so than I think about slavery, because again, you have a situation where you have a Tulsa, Black Wall Street, you have a Durham, North Carolina, you have a Rosedale, you have plenty communities of black people that during an era that was probably just as brutal as slavery, they were able to make something out of it, which goes to show that even under the same amount of atrocities that kind of roll over today, they were able to make the most out of it. But however, some particular way, we can find ways to say that, well, hey, this is a hindrance to us, or say that, well, that particular person is a sellout or that particular person is lucky, right? But going back to the basics of what Thomas Sowell said, which is, let's keep it basic. Let's work on some of the lifestyle decisions. Let's look at the aspect that he talked about, going back to what I said about the unemployment rate of married black couples, which was about 77% dating back to 1994. And if you want to go back further than that, basically he said that children that had access to newspapers, library cards, and basically reading materials, their unemployment rate seemingly was less than that of their white counterparts, right? So basically that kind of coincides with what I said about Dr. Ben Carson. So what does all that mean? It just means that there needs to be more responsibility taken at the home front, more so than waiting for government to come in and kind of intervene, because the ability to do better for yourself through a system of capitalism is there, right? But there needs to be a concerted effort to do so. But it seems that that particular same concerted effort to do so in 2021 is not the same concerted effort to do it right off the heels of slavery, when African Americans not only made great strides financially, they made great strides academically as well. Which brings me to another subject that he touched on. He said he didn't like affirmative action. And affirmative action basically is giving preferential treatment or in a selection process for schooling and sometimes for work to minority candidates, right? And so he basically stated that things like affirmative action is not just something that is a policy right here in the U.S. It's a policy that has its footprints all around the globe. That these particular programs were only supposed to last for a period of time. Kind of similar to income tax. Income tax was just something that was needed to help finance the war. It never went away. Never went away. Still here to this day. Never went away. Right? So, in recent news, we see that the Asians are in a battle due to affirmative action, which when you really stop and you think about it, affirmative action was supposed to be created for African Americans, yet other minority groups have jumped in and reaped the particular benefits, which he said was prevalent in East and West Pakistan, so much so that East Pakistan individuals left and created what is modern day Bangladesh because of those same particular principles, right? So his reasoning for not liking affirmative action is stated that you can have African American children that are going to these particular colleges and they don't necessarily fit the standards, right? Now, he didn't delve too far into that, but I thought for a minute back to some research that I did, where the research stated that the average American school teacher is a 43-year-old white woman with 10 plus years of experience. Percentage-wise, white females make up 79% of all teachers. Now, I like to kick it up to 80 because I don't like odd numbers more times than not. I like even numbers. So 80% of all teachers are white females. So obviously, you have to think that you can be excelling as a black student, running through the ranks throughout, school and, learning the way that white kids learn, but may not be learning it in the same particular manner. Which, again, brings up the question that African Americans and Hispanics score lower scores on SATs and ACTs than their white and Asian counterparts. Yet, we're in the same schools, right? So, he talked about when he was teaching at Cornell that half of the African American students that he was teaching, he found out were on like academic probation. And he couldn't understand why. Because he said when you look at it, they were scoring in the 75 percentile when it came to SAT scores. But the teaching style of the Ivy League schools seemed to be a little bit faster than what it is that they needed. I remember reading a story. It was a book I read recently. It may have been the book that I read about Bob Johnson and how he went to a prestigious university, and he stated how his grades slipped somewhat, but it was more so of a situation where it was some things going on. But that is a cultural shock, because you go from, obviously you've been trained, so to speak, to learn at this particular level to get to this particular place, right? But once you get there, it's a even bigger cultural shock to you, right? And while these particular schools are looked at to be prestigious, and I see all of the clippings every now and again that such and such black child did so well and they're going to this particular Ivy League school, and it seems like we never hear a follow-up story. You know, it's like it's excitement, and then next thing you know, it's like, hey, well, I wonder what happened, you know? But that's just me. And it makes me go back to data, which suggests that black children do better learning from black parents, and well, not black, of course you got black parents, black teachers, right? Which makes me think back to my aunt. My aunt, she's in her 70s. I have an uncle that's in his 70s as well. And I think, and I told my wife, I said, we're talking about a group of people that came up right before Brown versus Board of Education, where education was at the foremost, was at the front of their initiative. Going to college was not something that was basically, well, I might go, I might not go. No, it was one of those things like, yeah, you have to go because you have to compete. And I tell my wife, I said, this is probably the most, those baby boomers, and my mother, she went to a HBCU as well. We're talking about probably the most academically excellent African Americans that have graced America. You know, all this is prior to Brown versus Board of Education, and even more so after Brown versus Board of Education was fully enacted, right? To the point that I talked to my aunt, and it wasn't. It's not a situation, because she graduated her high school salutatorian. She went on to college and graduated salutatorian. So when you talk about claiming those type of accomplishments, right, you have to understand that there was a motivation out there, and that motivation was the aspect that you understand that academic prowess was at the utmost essence. And we look at it today, and kind of going back to what Mr. Sowell says about particular lifestyle, because I remember going to my aunt's house, and I remember seeing she had encyclopedias and stuff like that. And obviously when I was going, I didn't have the I didn't have the wherewithal to understand what an encyclopedia was at that particular time. Her husband, before my uncle, before he passed, was academically excellent. Their daughter, academically excellent, right? So these are the particular type of things that particular lifestyle for black people could do. Now, what's clouding that is what we have now, which is student loan debt, right? And I'm not a huge proponent for college now, but I'm a huge proponent for education because I am a example of a person that I made a choice in my life, and I feel like that I am better off because I made that particular choice. Now, whether I end up becoming a remembered figure doesn't matter, but I'm an example that a lifestyle choice is beneficial because you have to understand what's going on out here in this particular world, all right? And so, and I'm kind of, and I'm getting off on somewhat of a tangent, right? But in closing, in closing, I listened to and this episode was just to talk about the ideals of some of the things that Thomas Sowell has, which his last name is spelled Sowell, but it's also just to encompass the gaps that he filled in when he talked about the welfare state, war on poverty, particular things like that, because he stated that he felt that if there was no war on poverty and there was no welfare state, then there would be we would be basically living in a completely different America at this particular point in time. Because one of the things that he stated, which I agree with, is that there's no such thing as equality. There's no such thing. And I talked about this, and this to me is kind of a example of that. I can't remember the country it was, but there was a situation where the government would give people building materials and they could build their home. And what you did with the materials was completely up to you. You could build it however you want to build it. And there would be people that would get the same exact materials as someone else, but would become envious of someone that made it look a little bit better than theirs. So that's why I say you can't have equality, because everyone has options, everyone has choices, everyone has decisions that they particularly make. And with those decisions come ramifications. And again, I'm an example. I've made a decision when I went to college to not study hard. I didn't graduate. I didn't have jobs knocking down the door trying to employ me. It wasn't until I made a lifestyle change that I put myself in a position to get a job, which the job didn't require for me to have an immense amount of skills, but that particular job taught me a lot about choices and decisions. And whereas there are some people who look at this particular place and say, well, I can't go any higher, and that's because of decisions that I made or lifestyle changes that I do not want to change. That's fine, right? But if you have the ideal and the wherewithal to say, well, hey, I can do better than this, I just have to apply myself a little bit more, you can do that, right? And so that's kind of the thing of it, is that there's a divide amongst the black community. There's a divide. And you have, as Thomas Sowell said, that, and I said I was in closing, but I'm trying to get a little bit more out. He said that someone asked him, why didn't he try to conform a person like Jesse Jackson to his way of thinking? And he stated that, well, Jesse Jackson makes a lot more money than I do, indicating that the rhetoric that Jesse Jackson talks about, also Al Sharpton, because he stated that Al Sharpton had a situation where he owed millions of dollars in taxes. So he stated that in order for you to owe millions of dollars in taxes meant that you had to make millions of dollars, right? So he basically is against people that people dub race hustlers or race baiters, who bring race into each and every particular argument, and which again, that's a particular point that we don't just agree. Well, I don't agree with him wholeheartedly, but I agree to an extent, but I don't agree wholeheartedly. because I do feel that some people can get to a particular point to where they are in a position that it goes from wanting to be a pillar of light to a better life to becoming a person that is only concerned about their self-interest. So I can understand that particular objective at that particular time. But in closing, I want to talk about, just touch on something I saw with Candace Owens. Candace Owens, again, some people hate her, some people love her, and then you got people that are in the middle, which I consider myself in the middle. I can't say I hate you, but I can't say I love you, as far as like a person, a figurehead, a person that's talking. But she basically did an address. She talked to members of Congress, and I believe people of the Congressional Black Caucus were there in attendance. And she basically spoke about how she is not going to continue to allow for a political party to basically, again, welfare state, to basically victimize, or the victim mentality of black people, stating that we do not have the ability, nor do we possess the intellectual ability to make strides in this particular country, because we are only supposed to say that, well, we can only go so high because of a glass ceiling, right? Which, again, going back to Thomas Sowell, is the institutes, which the government, white supremacy, whatever you want to put in there. And that made me think about a saying from another content creator, which I listened to, in which he talked about a quote from Ayn Rand, in which it says that, and I'm paraphrasing, I'm not concerned about someone basically stopping me from getting to where I am. I'm not concerned about you stopping me from getting to where I am, but I want to know who's going to try and stop me, or it's something like that. I probably should have looked it up before I brought it out there, but it was an interesting quote nonetheless, basically saying that I don't believe that there's a ceiling on my potential, right? And I'm not going in with a notion or a mindset that someone has the ability to stop me from getting to where it is that I want to get to. And so, again, that ties back in to me to what Thomas Sowell says, that there need to be lifestyle changes. And once you make these particular lifestyle changes, that is when you really can see the betterment of people. And particularly in our community, a lifestyle change like that would be revolutionary, right? But got a little long-winded on this one, but I wanted to get all this particular stuff out. So that's another episode of Paradigm 132 Podcast. And if you follow me, or whatever, on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays, I do Facebook Live videos where I do news of the day or particular thoughts of the day that I have. Also, Porter City 2, The Rebirth, available on paradigm132.com. So get your copy, and I'm out. Peace.